guys, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for joining me for another special History and Games episode. Today I am joined by Max Miller, the creator and host of a very popular, very entertaining, very funny YouTube channel called Tasting History. Hi Max, how are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm really great. Before we go any further, I wanted to give you a chance to sort of explain to people what tasting history is, because it's really awesome and I think my audience would really love it.
Yeah, Tasting History is a YouTube channel where I pick old recipes. There's no real time period. It's from whenever, ancient times, medieval England, the Renaissance, whenever, and I do my best to recreate them, but in a fairly easy way that you could then do at home. And then I talk about the history of the dish, or the time period, or the culture that it comes from. And it's light, it's fun. There's nothing serious about it until you get to the comments, but don't read the comments.
Oh my gosh, I hear you on the comments part, but you know, it is serious in one way. The thing that impresses me is it's a deep dive into history. That's why I like it so much. It kind of reminds me of my own channel, where it's just like, yes, we use a fun vehicle, either video games or food, but like you're very serious about your research.
Yeah, I mean, each episode, I have a fair amount of kind of backlog of information in my brain, because I love to read. I just love to learn, always have. So I have, I'm always able to bring something to whatever episode I'm writing without having to go do research. But then that kind of leads me down the rabbit hole. And usually for an episode, I can do anywhere from 5 or 6 hours to 20 or 30 hours of research before I'm ready to write a script. So sometimes it is pretty deep, and sometimes it kind of meanders because I like to tell a story. I don't like to just spout historical facts or whatever. I kind of like it to have a little bit of an arc, because I think for me that's what I like about history, is that it's stories. So that's kind of how I try to get it out there.
What are some of the challenges that you deal with when you're trying to find and recreate these ancient recipes?
Yeah. So especially with the ancient ones, like before medieval Europe, part of the problem is, one, finding the ingredients, like silphium. You can't find silphium, it's extinct. And it has been extinct since the Roman Empire, but there's one called asafoetida, that is, or asafoetida, some people say, that's supposedly probably similar to it. I actually just cooked with it for the first time this week. And, even that is not that easy to find. Granted, with the internet, you can get anything pretty much shipped to you, but during quarantine, I started this channel basically at the beginning of lockdown. So getting grains of paradise from Amazon was impossible. There was no place to get it. They said, no, we're shipping toilet paper only. So I ended up I was able to find a place in Ghana that actually grew them, and then they usually shipped via Amazon, but I emailed them and was like, hey, can you ship these directly to me? And they did, but it took 4 months. So by the time that I got them, Amazon was back to someone I could have got them overnight, but whatever.
After all of that, but that's a bit like, how do you track down these ingredients? Because that's like, I would not have thought to look in like Ghana or anywhere. I'd be like, well, Amazon or like Chef Shop is just down, so I don't know what to do. Like, what is the process of like trying to track these ingredients down?
So I went for that, and for a few other spices, I went to eBay. I went to a few different places, and on there you can actually contact the seller. So even though they were like not doing anything, I was able to contact the seller and be like, hey, can you send these to me? And they were like, yeah, we're in Ghana, and so it's going to take some time.
It's funny because I was watching your video on Kikion, which is like this very odd, unusual, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, this unusual barley drink from Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, where it's like barley mill and it's like premium wine, this sort of wine that they're not totally sure about, and like honey and cheese. And I was watching that, and That seemed to be a very interesting experience. Obviously, not everything you make is delicious and tasty. Well, I mean, maybe to the ancient Greeks were, but your reaction was pretty priceless.
So with Kikion, I don't know that it was supposed to be tasty. It's a medicine, really. He calls it a potion in the Iliad, I believe, and it was meant to like strengthen people who are on death's door. So not necessarily supposed to taste good. It was more the texture actually that was horrible. But also then there's always the possibility that I didn't make it like they did. In fact, it's almost impossible that I did make it exactly like they did, because we don't have a recipe. All that we have is a list of a few ingredients, and we have some records of how the texture would have been. So, I try to make it clear, because I'm not a professional historian, I'm not a professional chef by any means, and I try to make it clear that this is my best guess. This is my version of things. And sometimes people online will correct me, and happy to be corrected. And then sometimes people will say, no, Pramnian wine was exactly like this. Well, you don't know that, because
No.
nobody knows that. So, so it's kind of with things like that, you just gotta make your best guess and then have fun, because it's supposed to be fun. I'm not going to sell this stuff in a store. It's supposed to be fun.
I noticed in that same video you mentioned Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which later I was watching a video you were doing about Alfred the Great and these sort of oat cakes. And it's funny because there's a video game coming up called Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which is all about the Viking raids during Alfred the Great's time. And I only was able to cover it a little bit in History and Games. So I was really happy that you had this video about making these cakes. But there's this very odd, almost random story about Alfred the Great, who's pushing back the Vikings, but it's not going well. He goes off to hide in like the marshes or something. And he comes across a peasant's house, and she, the wife of this, I forget what it was, like a swineherd or whatever, like allows him to stay and hide out. And he has one job. He's supposed to look after these cakes and make sure they don't burn. And he goes and stares off in space. And she comes back and she's like, my cakes are burning. You had one job. And he's like, whoops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. And it's like it's like this entertaining story, but it is so random. Can you tell me about sort of like how you came across this story and why you're like, I got to try this recipe?
So that story was, like I mentioned, something that I already knew, because I love history. So I knew the story, and excuse me, and so I wanted to tell the story, and I was like, well, let me recreate oatcakes possibly the way that they would have been created back then. It's an interesting story because, I mean, it's almost definitely apocryphal. There's almost no way that actually happened. A lot of stories, especially the Anglo-Saxons, were all about telling these stories that had a moral or something. But then it's like figuring out, well, what is the moral of this story? There's a really great story about a later king called Canute the Great, who was a Danish Viking who came over and took over England in the early 1000s and 1000s, 11th century.
There you go.
And there's a story about he took his witan, who's like all of his advisors, and he took his throne and he set it down in the sand by the sea, and he commanded the waves or the tide to not come in. He was going to sit there and the tide was not going to come in. Well, surprise, the tide came in and he got his feet wet and they had to move his throne. And that's the story. So now you get to kind of come up with the moral of that story. Was it that he was a fool and he thought he had all this power and he clearly didn't, and God had the power? Or is it he was showing his witan, you know what, there are limits even to my power? So it's almost exactly opposite. So you can take whatever you want from these stories.
Sure. I'm sure he was like, oh no, I was totally making a point. It didn't
Exactly.
go the way I wanted, but you'll never know. Yeah, because I was thinking about that. I was like, I can't wait for Assassin's Creed Valhalla because, you can get into like Viking rap battles and you get to like drunken archery contests and all these things. I'm like, but will we have a cooking contest with Alfred the Great to see who doesn't burn cakes? Like, can we have like a cooking mama thing where you have like a little cook off? I mean, I think that would be freaking hilarious. I have no idea if they'll reference this in the game, but I will be so disappointed if they don't. So you've done tons of different recipes so far. What would you say is your favorite that you've made?
I think my favorite that I made is I really like the syllabub. I loved it because one, it was very easy. Excuse me. It was very easy, and two, it's sweet alcoholic whipped cream. What's not to like?
Right?
You know?
That combines everything. That's so great.
I also think it would be something that would be great to kind of bring back, like, because you could change the flavors. There could be all sorts of different kinds. You could change the alcohol that goes into them. It could be port or sherry or Gewürztraminer or whatever kind of wine, brandy, and then you could also change, instead of orange blossom water, you could have all sorts of different flavors. I think I'm going to start like a food truck that just sells different types of syllabub.
I'm there. I'll buy it all right now. That is amazing. Just breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I got it. It's perfect. Okay, so we talked about the tastiest and best. What was your worst experience so far?
The worst experience would have to be the garum that I made, which was actually the video that kind of got big. That
Right, sort of really put tasting history on the map.
yeah. And it's so interesting because I didn't make the actual what most Romans would think of as garum, because that is a fermented fish sauce that takes a long time, and the smell is so bad that the factories had to be moved away from cities. And I live in a condo surrounded by other people, and I have a fiance. That was just a non-starter for me. So I made an authentic recipe from ancient Rome, though it's actually from the Byzantine Empire, for like quick garum. And it's basically, do you need garum today? Here, this will do. And so it doesn't have the umami flavors that you'll get with fermentation, but it's very complex. It's more complex than just like salt water. But it was still, the smell was so horrific.
Oh my gosh.
That our house smelled for like 2 weeks. And it was terrible.
Oh no. Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's brutal.
I'm no longer allowed to boil fish in the house.
Oh yeah, I get the feeling you won't be doing that one again anytime soon. I wanted to ask you about foods or recipes that you haven't tried that you really want to, because I love Japanese history. And I would love to see some Japanese recipes. Yes, I'm putting in a request.
So I was actually going to say Japanese and Chinese cuisine. Here, let me see if I can't pull out this huge book that I just got.
Yeah, because I'm playing Ghost of Tsushima right now, which is a samurai action RPG. And I noticed that they have sake, but they don't feature a lot of food. And I'm like, oh man, it'd be really cool to sort of see what they would have eaten in the Kamakura era, because it probably wouldn't be what we know as Japanese food today. A lot of it didn't exist. So I'm just saying somebody could educate us on that.
So part of the issue with basically with any food outside of Europe and America is there are a lot fewer recipes. There are some recipes from China. There are some recipes from Japan, some from India. I did an Indian episode recently, and the Middle East, but a lot less. That said, China did a very good job at writing down recipes, but they're so hard to find because a lot of them have never been translated. But there is this cool book that I just got called A Soup. I don't know if you can see it. A Soup for the Khan. Q-A-N. And it has a ton of recipes from around like the time of the Mongols. And I just got it, so I haven't dug into it yet, but I'm going to. And then there are a few collections of Japanese recipes, but again, one of the best that would be easiest to recreate a dish from is actually at that time when the Dutch came and settled, or not settled, but came and visited and started trading with Japan. And so you have a lot of Dutch influence. Tempura, for example, we think of it as classically Japanese dish, but really it's a major Dutch infusion of cooking styles. So finding those recipes from much earlier is hard. So there's a lot more guesswork. And for me, most of the history that I know, most of the food that I know is European and American. So it takes a lot more research. Like I mentioned, sometimes I'll research for 5 or 6 hours. Sometimes I'll research for 30. When I did my episode on Indian payasam, it was, the research took me so much longer than usual because I was starting at zero. I had no information in my brain already about the dish, about the culture, about that time period in 12th century